The other psychological assessments involving handwriting analysis or graphological assessment. The work is done by a pair of trained graphologists assisted by a small number of measured technicians. They generally require at least a page of handwritten script by the subject. Measurements are made of about 30 different writing characteristics, and these are charted and furnished to the graphologists for assessments. The psychologists also give courses in psychological assessment to a group of the operations officers to sharpen their own capabilities to size up people. As part of the training course, the instructor does a psychological assessment of each student. The students are willing participants and results are discussed with them. It is important to reiterate that the psychological assessments are only a service to the operations officers. In the final analysis, it should be the responsibility of operations officer to decide how a political agent should be approached, or to make a judgment as to whether any agent is telling the truth. Admiral Turner. This kind of thing we are interested in. What will motivate a man to become an agent of the United States in a difficult situation? We have to be familiar with that kind of attitudinal response that we can expect from people we approach to, for one reason or another, become our spies. But I will be happy to submit a very specific listing of these. Senator Kennedy, would you do that for the committee? In the follow-ups, in the MK search, in the often, and the Chickwit, could you give us also a report on those particular programs? Admiral Turner, yes, sir. Senator Kennedy, did they involve experimentation, human experimentation? Admiral Turner, no, sir. Senator Kennedy, none of them? Admiral Turner, let me say this, that Chickwit program is the code name for a CIA participation in what was basically a Department of Defense program. This program was summarized and reported to the Church Committee, to the Congress, and I have since they have been rementioned in the press in the last 2 days here. I have not had time to go through and personally review them. I have ascertained that all of the files that we had and made available before are intact, and I have put a special order out of that nobody will enter those files or in any way touch them without my permission at this point. But they are in the Retired Records Center outside of Washington, and they are available. I'm not prepared to give you full details on it because I simply haven't read into that part of our history. But in addition, I would suggest when we want to get into that, we should get the Department of Defense in with us. Senator Kennedy, well, you will supply that information to the Intelligence Committee. The relevant, the health aspects, obviously, and the research we are interested in? Admiral Turner, yes, sir. Senator Kennedy, will you let us know, Admiral Turner? Admiral Turner, I will be happy to. See page 169 for the material referred to. Senator Kennedy, thank you. I am running out of time. Do you support the extension of the Protection of Human Subjects legislation to include the CIA and the Department of Defense? You commented favorably on that. End of page 22. Beginning of page 23. Before, and I am hopeful we can get that on the calendar early in September, and that is our strong interest. Admiral Turner, the CIA certainly has no objection to that proposed legislation, sir. It is not my role in the administration to be the supporter of it or the endorser of it. Senator Kennedy, as a personal matter, since you have reviewed these subjects, would you comment? I know it is maybe unusual, but you can understand what we are attempting to do. Admiral Turner, yes, sir. Senator Kennedy, from your own experience in the agency, you can understand the value of it. Just finally, in your own testimony now, with this additional information, it seems quite apparent to me that you can reconstruct in very careful detail this whole project in terms of the responsible CIA officials for the program. You have so indicated in your testimony. Now, with the additional information and the people that have been revealed in the examination of the documents, it seems to be pretty clear that you can track that whole program in very careful detail. And I would hope, that you would want to get to the bottom of it, as the Congress does as well. I will come back to that in my next round. Thank you very much. Senator Inouye. Senator Goldwater? Senator Goldwater. I have no questions. Senator Inouye. Senator Schweiker? Senator Schweiker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Turner, I would like to go back to your testimony on page 12, where you discuss the contribution to the building fund of a private institution, a private medical institution. You state, quote, indeed, it was mentioned in a 1957 Inspector General report on the Technical Service Division of CIA, pertinent portions of which have been reviewed by the Church Committee staff, end quote. I would like to have you consider this question very carefully. I served as a member of the original Church Committee. My staffer did a lot of the work that you are referring to here. He made notes on the IG's report. My question to you is, are you saying that the selection that specifically delineates an improper contribution was in fact given to the Church Committee staff to see? Admiral Turner, the answer to your question is yes. The information that a contribution has been made was made available, to the best of my knowledge. Senator Schweiker, only certain sections of the report were made available. The report had to be reviewed out at Langley. It was not reviewed here, and copies were not given to us here. I just want you to carefully consider what you are saying, because the only record we have are the notes that the staff took on anything that was of significance. Admiral Turner, my understanding was that Mr. Maxwell was shown the relevant portion of this report that disclosed the contribution had been made. Senator Schweiker, to follow this up further, I'd like to say that I think there was a serious flaw in the way that the IG report was handled and the Church Committee was limited. I am not making any accusations, but because of limited access to the report, we have a situation, the end of page 23, the beginning of page 24, where it is not even clear whether we actually saw the material or not, simply because we could not keep a copy of the report under the procedures we had to follow. We were limited by note-taking, and so it is rather ambiguous as to just what was seen and what was not seen. I certainly hope that the new Intelligence Committee will not be bound by procedures that so restrict its ability to exercise effective oversight. I have a second question. Does it concern you, Admiral, that we used a subterfuge which resulted in the use of federal construction grant funds to finance facilities for these sorts of experiments on our own people? Because as I understand what you are saying, while the CIA may only put up $375,000, this triggered a response on the part of the federal government to provide, on a good faith basis, matching hospital funds at the same level. We put up more than $1 million of matching funds, some based on an allegedly private donation, which was really CIA money. Is there something basically wrong with that? Admiral Turner: I certainly believe there is. As I stated, the General Counsel of the CIA at the time rendered a legal opinion that this was a legal undertaking. And again, I am hesitant to go back and revisit the atmosphere, the laws, the attitudes at the time. So whether the council was on good legal ground or not, I am not enough of a lawyer to be sure. But it certainly would occur to me if it happened today as a very questionable activity. Senator Schweiker: Well, I think those of us who worked on and amended the Hill-Burton Act and other hospital construction assistance laws over the years would have a rather different opinion on the legal intent or object of Congress in passing laws to provide hospital construction project money. These funds weren't intended for this. It reminds me a little bit of the selfish toxin situation which turned up when I was on the church committee. The Public Health Service was used to produce a deadly weapon with public health money. Here we are using general hospital construction money to carry on a series of drug experiments. Admiral Turner: Excuse me, sir. If I could just be, I think, accurate, I don't think any of this $375,000 or the matching funds were used to conduct drug experiments. They were used to build the hospital. Now, the CIA then puts more money into a foundation that was conducting research on the CIA's behalf, supposedly in that hospital. So the intent was certainly there, but the money was not used for experimentation. Senator Schweiker: Well, I understand it was used for bricks and mortar, but the bricks were used to build the facility where the experiments were carried on, were they not? Admiral Turner: We do not have positive evidence that they were. It certainly would seem that that was the intention, but I do not want to draw inferences here. Senator Schweiker: Well, why else would they give this money for the building fund if the building was not used for a purpose that benefited the CIA program? Admiral Turner: I certainly draw the inference that the CIA expected to benefit from it, and some of the wording says the general, end of page 24, end of page 20, beginning of page 25. General Counsel's opinion was that this was legal only if the CIA was going to derive adequate benefit from it. But sir, there is no evidence of what benefit was derived. Senator Schweiker: There must have been some pretty good benefits at stake. The Atomic Energy Commission was to bear a share of the cost, and when they backed out for some reason or another, the CIA picked up part of their tab. So, at two different points, there were indications that CIA decision makers thought there was great benefit to be derived from whatever happened within the brick and mortar walls of that facility. Admiral Turner: You are absolutely right. I am only taking the position that I cannot substantiate that there was benefit derived. Senator Schweiker: The agreement documents say that the CIA would have access to 1/6 of the space involved in the construction of the wing. So how would you enter into an agreement on that specifically says that you will have access to and use of 1/6 of the space and not perform something in that space? I cannot believe it was empty. Admiral Turner: Sir, I am not disputing you at all, but both of us are saying that the inference is that the 1/6 of the space was used, that experimentation was done, and so on, but there is no factual evidence of what went on as a result of that payment or what went on in that hospital. It is just missing. It is not that it didn't happen. Senator Schweiker. Admiral Turner, one other Senator Kennedy. Would the senator yield on that point? Senator Schweiker. I understand that in the agency's documents on the agreement, it was explicitly stated that 1/6 of the facility would be designated for CIA use and made available for CIA research. Are you familiar, Mr. Brody? Senator, as I recall, you are right in that there is a mention of 1/6, but any mention at all has to do with planning. There are no subsequent reports as to what happened after the construction took place. Senator Schweiker. Admiral Turner, I read in the New York Times that part of this series of MKUltra experiments involved an arrangement with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics to test LSD surreptitiously on unwitting patrons in bars in New York and San Francisco. Some of the subjects became violently ill and were hospitalized. I wonder if you would just briefly describe what we were doing there and how it was carried out. I assume it was through a safe house operation. I don't believe your statement went into much detail. Admiral Turner, I did mention the safe house operation in my statement, sir. That is how these were carried out. What we have learned from the new documentation is the location and the dates at which the safe houses were run by the CIA, and the identification of 3 individuals who were associated with running those safe houses. We know something about the construction work that was done in them because there were contracts for this. Beyond that, we are pretty much drawing inferences as to the things that went on as to what you are saying here. Senator Schweiker. Well, the subjects are unwitting. You can infer that much, right? Admiral Turner. Right. End of page 25. Beginning of page 26. Senator Schweiker, if you happen to be at the wrong bar at the wrong place and time, you got it. Mr. Brody. Senator, that would be contacts were made, as we understand it, in bars, etc., and then the people may have been invited to these safe houses. There really isn't any indication as to the fact that this took place in the bars. Admiral Turner, we are trying to be very precise with you, sir, not to draw in an inference here. There are 6 cases of these 149 where we have enough evidence in this new documentation to substantiate that there was unwitting testing, and some of that involves these safe houses. There are other cases where it is ambiguous as to whether testing was witting or voluntary. There are others where it was clearly voluntary. Senator Schweiker. Of course, after a few drinks, it is questionable whether informed consent means anything to a person in a bar anyway. Admiral Turner. Well, we don't have any indication that all these cases where it is ambiguous involve drinking of any kind. There are cases in penal institutions where it is not clear whether the prisoner was given a choice or not. I don't know that he wasn't given a choice, but I don't positively know that he was, and I classify that as an ambiguous incident. Senator Inouye. Your time is up, Senator. Senator Huddleston. Question mark. Senator Huddleston. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Turner, you stated in your testimony that you are convinced there was no attempt to conceal this recently discovered documentation during the earlier searches. Did you question the individuals connected with the earlier search before you made that judgment? Admiral Turner, yes, I haven't. I don't think questioned everybody who looked in the files or is still on our payroll who looked in the files back in 1975. But Mr. Lobinger on my left is the best authority on this, and I have gone over it with him in some detail. Senator Huddleston, but you have inquired, you think, sufficiently to assure yourself that there was no intent on the part of any person to conceal these records from the previous committee? Admiral Turner, I am persuaded of that both by my questioning of the people and by the circumstances and the way in which these documents were filled, by the fact which I did not and should have mentioned in my testimony, that these were not the official files. The ones that we have received or retrieved were copies of files that were working files that somebody had used, and therefore were slipped into a different location. And again, I say to you, sir, I can't imagine they're deliberately concealing these particular files and revealing the other things that they did reveal in 1975. I don't see the motive for that, because there are not that damning comparing with the overall material that was provided. Senator Huddleston, is this the kind of operation that if it were continuing now, or if there were anything similar to it, that you would feel compelled to report to the Senate, to the Select Committee on Intelligence? Admiral Turner, yes, sir. You mean if I discovered that something like this were going on without my knowledge? Yes, I would feel absolutely required to. Senator Huddleston. End of page 26, beginning of page 27. Senator Huddleston, but if it were going on with your knowledge, would you report it to the committee? I assume you would. Admiral Turner, yes, well, it would not be going on with my knowledge, but theoretically the answer is yes, sir. Senator Huddleston, well then, what suggestions would you have as we devise charters for the various intelligence agencies? What provision would you suggest to prohibit this kind of activity from taking place? Would you suggest that it ought to be specifically outlined in a statutory charter setting out the parameters of permissible operation of the various agencies? Admiral Turner, I think that certainly is something we must consider as we look at the legislation for charters. I am not on the face of it opposed to it. I think we would have to look at the particular wording, as we are going to have to deal with the whole charter issue, as to exactly how precise you want to be in delineating restraints and curbs on the intelligence activities. Senator Huddleston, in the case of sensitive type operations, which this certainly was, which might be going on today, is the oversight activity of the agency more insensitive now than it was at the time? Admiral Turner, much more so. I mean, I have briefed you, sir, and the Committee on our sensitive operations. We have Intelligence Oversight Board. We have a procedure in the National Security Council for approval of very sensitive operations. I think the amount of spotlight focused on these activities is many-fold what it was in these 12 to 24 years ago. Senator Huddleston, how about the record keeping? Admiral Turner, yes, I can't imagine anyone having the gall to think that he can just literally destroy records today with all of the attention that has come to this. And certainly we are emphasizing that is not the case. Senator Huddleston, Admiral, I was particularly interested in the activity that took place at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital at Lexington, Kentucky, in which a Dr. Harris Isbell conducted experiments on people who were presumably patients there. There was a narcotics institution, I take it. And Dr. Isbell was, according to the New York Times story, carrying on a secret series of correspondences with an individual at the agency by the name of Ray. Have you identified who this person is? Admiral Turner: Sir, I find myself in a difficult position here at a public hearing to confirm or deny these names in a view of my legal responsibilities under the Privacy Act, not to disclose the names of individuals here. Senator Huddleston: I am just asking you if you have identified the person referred to in the article as Ray. I am not asking you who he was. I just want to know if you know who he is. Admiral Turner: No, I am sorry. Was this W-R-A-Y or R-A-Y? Senator Huddleston: It is listed in the news article as letters R-A-Y in quotations. Admiral Turner: No, sir, we have not identified him. Senator Huddleston: So you have no knowledge of whether or not he is a member of your staff or connected with the agency in any way? Have you attempted to identify him? End of page 27. Beginning of page 28. Pause. Admiral Turner: Senator, we have a former employee whose first name is Ray, who may have had some connection with these activities. Senator Huddleston: You suspect that, but you have not verified that at the time, or at least you are not in a position to indicate that you have verified it. Admiral Turner: That is correct. Senator Huddleston: Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Inouye: Senator Wallop: Senator Wallop: Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Turner: Not all of the, and in no way trying to excuse you of the hideous nature of some of these projects, but not all of the projects under MKUltra are of a sinister or even a moral nature. Is that a fair statement? Admiral Turner: That is correct. Senator Wallop: Looking down through some of these 17 projects, not involving human testing, aspects of the magician's art, it doesn't seem as though there are anything very sinister about that. Studies of human behavior and sleep research, library searches. Now, those things in their own way are still of interest, are they not, to the process of intelligence gathering? Admiral Turner: Yes, sir. I have not tried to indicate that we either are not doing or would not do any of the things that were involved in MKUltra. But when it comes to the witting or unwitting testing of people with drugs, that is certainly verboten, but there are other things. Senator Wallop: Even with volunteer patients? I mean, I am not trying to put you on the spot to say whether it is going on, but I mean, it is not an uncommon thing. It is in the prisons of the United States for the Public Health Service to conduct various kinds of experiments with vaccines and, say, sunburn creams. I know in Arizona they have done so. Admiral Turner: My understanding is lots of that is authorized, but I am not of the opinion that this is not the CIA's business, and that if we need some information in that category, I would prefer to go to other appropriate authorities of the government and ask them to get it for us, rather than to in any way. Senator Wallop: Well, you know, you have the library searches and attendance at national seminars. This is why I wanted to ask you if the bulk of these projects were in any way the kinds of things that the agency might not do now. A president would not have been horrified by the list of the legitimate types of things. Isn't that probably the case? Admiral Turner: Yes, sir. Senator Wallop: And if it did in fact appear in the IG report, Is there any reason to suppose that the President did not know of this project? You said there was no reason to suppose that he did, but let me reverse that. Is there any reason to suppose that they did not? Admiral Turner: No. Senator Wallop: Well, I just cannot imagine you or literally anybody undertaking projects of the magnitude of dollars here and just not knowing about it, not informing your superior that these were going on. End of page 28, page 29. Especially when certain items of it appear in the Inspector General's report on budget matters. I'm going to take a brief pause for a moment. I'm going to resume. Admiral Turner: Well, I find it difficult when it is that far back to hypothesize what the procedures that the director was using in terms of informing his superiors were. It is a different climate from today, and I think we do a lot more informing today than they did back then. But I find it very difficult to guess what the level of knowledge was. Senator Wallop: I am really not asking you to second guess it, but it just seems to me that while the past is the past, and thank goodness we are operating under different sets of circumstances, I think it is naive for us to suppose that these things were conducted entirely without the knowledge of the President of the United States. During those times, it is just the kinds of research information that was being sought was vital to the United States, not the means, but the information that they were trying to find. Admiral Turner: Sorry, your question is, was this vital? Did we know? Did we view it as vital? Senator Wallop: Well, your implication at the beginning was that it was a response to the kinds of behavior that were seen in Cardinal Mindszenty's trial and other things. Somebody must have thought that this was an important defense reaction, if nothing else, on the part of the United States. Admiral Turner: Yes, sir, I'm sure they did. But again, I just don't know how high that permeated the executive branch. Senator Wallop: But the kinds of information are still important to you. I am not suggesting that anyone go back and do that kind of thing again, but I am certain it would be of use to you to know what was going to happen to one of your agents, assuming someone had put one of those things into his bloodstream or tried to modify his behavior. Admiral Turner: Absolutely, and we would be very concerned if we thought there were things like truth serums or other things that our agents or others could be subjected to by use or improper use of drugs or by other powers against our people or agents. Senator Wallop: Are there? I don't ask you to name them, but are there such serums? Admiral Turner: I don't know them if there are. I would have to answer that for a second. Sir. I would have to answer that for the record, sir. Senator Wallop: I would appreciate that. The material referred to follows, quote, truth, and quote, drugs, in interrogation. The search for effective aids to interrogation is probably as old as man's need to obtain information from an uncooperative source, and as persistent as his impatience to shortcut any tortuous path. In the annals of police investigation, physical coercion has at times been substituted for painstaking and time-consuming inquiry in the belief that direct methods produce quick results. Sir James Stevens, writing in 1883, rationalizes a grisly example of, quote, third-degree, end quote, practices by the police of India. Quote, "It is far pleasanter to sit comfortably in the shade rubbing a red pepper in a poor devil's eyes than to go about in the sun hunting up evidence." End quote. More recently, police officials in some countries have turned to drugs for assistance in extracting confessions from accused persons. Drugs which are... The word is cut out. That's the end of page 29, beginning of page 30, which are, I'm assuming it says, consumed to relax the individual's defenses to the point that he unknowingly reveals truths he has been trying to conceal. This investigative technique, however, humanitarian as an alternative to physical torture, still raises serious questions of the individual's rights and liberties. In this country, where drugs have gained only marginal acceptance in police work, their use has provoked cries of, quote, psychological third degree, end quote, and has precipitated medico-legal controversies that, after a quarter of a century, still occasionally flare into the open. The use of so-called, quote, truth, end quote, drugs in police work is similar to the accepted psychiatric practices of narcoanalysis. The difference in the two procedures lies in their different objectives. The police investigator is concerned with empirical truth that may be used against the suspect, and therefore almost solely with probative truth. The usefulness of the suspect's revelations depend ultimately on their acceptance in evidence by a court of law. The psychiatrist, on the other hand, using the same, quote, truth, unquote, drugs in a diagnosis and treatment of the mentally ill, is primarily concerned with the psychological truth or the psychological reality rather than empirical fact. A patient's aberrations are reality for him at the time they occur, and an accurate account of these fantasies and delusions, rather than reliable recollection of past events, can be the key to recovery. The notion of drugs capable of illuminating hidden recesses of the mind, helping to heal the mentally ill, and preventing or reversing the miscarriage of justice, has provided an exceeding durable theme for the press and popular literature. While acknowledging that truth serum is a misnomer twice over, the drugs are not sera, and they do not necessarily bring forth probative truth. Journalistic accounts continue to exploit the appeal of the term. The formula is to play up a few spectacular, quote, truth, end quote, drug successes, and to imply that the drugs are more maligned than need be, and more widely employed in criminal investigation than can be officially admitted. Any technique that promises an increment of success in extracting information from an uncompliant source is ipso facto of interest in intelligence operations. If the ethical considerations which in Western countries inhibit the use of narco-interrogation in police work, are felt also in intelligence, the Western services must at least be prepared against its possible employment by the adversary. An understanding of, quote, truth, end quote, drugs and their characteristic actions and their potentialities, positive and negative, for eliciting useful information is fundamental to an adequate defense against them. This discussion is meant to help towards such an understanding, draws primarily upon openly published materials. It has the limitations of projecting from criminal investigative practices and from the permissiveness atmosphere of drug psychotherapy. Scopolamine as truth serum. Early in this century, physicians began to employ scopolamine along with morphine and chloroform to induce a state of, quote, twilight sleep, end quote, during childbirth. A constituent of henbane, scopolamine was known to produce sedation and drowsiness, confusion and disorientation, incoordination and amnesia for events experienced during intoxication. Yet, physicians noted that women in twilight sleep answered questions accurately and volunteered exceedingly candid remarks. In 1922, it occurred to Robert House, a Dallas, Texas obstetrician, that a similar technique might be employed in the interrogation of suspected criminals, and he arranged to interview under scopolamine 2 prisoners in the Dallas County Jail whose guilt seemed clearly confirmed. Under the drug, both men denied charges on which they were held, and both, upon trial, were found not guilty. Enthusiastic at this success, House concluded that a patient under the influence of scopolamine, quote, cannot create a lie, and there is no power to think or reason, end quote. His experiment and this conclusion attracted wide attention, and the idea of a truth drug was launched upon the public consciousness. The phrase truth serum is believed to have first appeared in a news report of House experiments in the Los Angeles Record. Sometime in 1922, House resisted the term for a while, but eventually came to employ it regularly himself. He published some 11 articles on scopolamine in the years 1921 to 1929, with a notice of a with a noticeable increase in polemic zeal as time went on. What had begun as something of a scientific statement turned finally into a dedicated crusade by the, quote, father of truth serum, end quote, on behalf of his offspring, wherein he was, quote, grossly indulgent of its wayward behavior, end quote, and stubbornly proud of its minor achievements, end quote. End of page 30. Beginning of page 31. Only a handful of cases in which scopolamine was used for police interrogation came to public notice, though there is evidence suggesting that some police forces may have used it extensively. 2 and 16. Those are citations. 2 and 16. One police writer claims that the threat of scopolamine interrogation has been effective in extracting confessions from criminal suspects who are told they will first be rendered unconscious by chloral hydrate placed covertly in their coffee or drinking water. 16. Citation 16. 3. just to clarify. Because of a number of undesirable side effects, scopolamine was shortly disqualified as a truth drug. Among the most disabling of the side effects are hallucinations, disturbed perception, somnolence, and physiological phenomena such as headache, rapid heart, blurred vision, which distract the subject from the central purpose of the interview. Furthermore, the physical action is long far outlasting than the psychological effects. Scopolamine continues, in some cases, to make anesthesia and surgery safer by drying the mouth and throat and reducing secretions that might obstruct the air passages. But the fantastically, almost painfully dry desert mouth brought on by the drug is hardly conducive to free talking, even in a tractable subject. The barbiturates. The first suggestion that the drugs might facilitate communication with emotionally disturbed patients came quite by accident in 1916. Arthur S. Lovenhart and his associates at the University of Wisconsin, experimenting with respiratory stimulants, were surprised when, after an injection of sodium cyanide, a catatonic patient who had long been mute and rigid suddenly relaxed, opened his eyes, and even answered a few questions. By the early 1930s, a number of psychiatrists were experimenting with drugs as an adjunct to establish methods of therapy. At about this time, police officials, still attracted by the possibility that drugs might help in the interrogation of suspects and witnesses, turned to a class of depressant drugs known as barbiturates. By 1935, Clarence W. Muhlberger, head of the Michigan Crime Detection Laboratory at East Lansing, was using barbiturates on reluctant suspects though police work continued to be hampered by the court's rejection of drug-induced confessions, except in a few carefully circumscribed instances. The barbiturates, first synthesized in 1903, are among the oldest of modern drugs and the most versatile of all depressants. In this half-century, some 2,500 have been prepared, and about 24 of these have won an important place in medicine. An estimated 3 to 4 billion doses of barbiturates are prescribed by physicians in the United States each year, and they have come to be known by a variety of commercial names and colorful slang terms, quote, goofballs, end quote, luminal nembutal, quote, red devils, end quote, yellow jackets, end quote, pink ladies, end quote, etc. 3 of them, which are used in narcoanalysis, have seen service as truth drugs, are sodium amytal, amobarbital, pentothal sodium, thiopental, and to a lesser extent, seconal, secobarbital. As one pharmacologist explains it, a subject coming under the influence of barbiturate injected intravenously goes through all the stages of progressive drunkenness, but the time scale is on the order of minutes instead of hours. Outwardly, the sedation effect is dramatic, especially if the subject is a psychiatric patient in tension. His features slacken, his body relaxes. Some people are momentarily excited, a few become silly and giggly. This usually passes and most subjects fall asleep, emerging later in disoriented semi-wakefulness. The descent into narcosis and beyond with progressively larger doses can be divided as follows. Sedative stage 1. 2. Unconsciousness with exaggerated reflexes, hyperactive stage. 3. Unconsciousness without reflex, even to painful stimuli. 4. Death. Whether all these stages can be distinguished in any given subject depends largely on the dose and the rapidity with which the drug is induced. In anesthesia, stages 1 and 2 may only last 2 or 3 seconds. The first or sedative stage can be divided further. Plane 1, no evident effect or slight sedative effect. Plane 2, cloudiness, calmness, amnesia. Upon recovery, the subject will not remember what happened at this or, quote, lower, end quote, planes or stages. Plane 3, slurred speech, old thought patterns disrupted, inability to integrate or learn new patterns, poor coordination, subject becomes unaware of painful stimuli. End of page 31. Beginning of page 32. Plane 3 is the psychiatric, quote, work, end quote, stage. It may last only a few minutes, but it can be extended by further slow injection of drug. The usual practice is to bring the subject quickly to stage 2 and to conduct the interview as he passes back into the sedative stage on the way to full consciousness. Clinical and experimental studies. To the general abhorrence in Western countries for the use of chemical agents, quote, to make people do things against their will, end quote, has precluded serious systematic study, at least as published openly, of the potentialities of drugs for interrogation. Louis A. Gottschalk, surveying their use in information-seeking interviews, citation 13, cites 136 references, but only 2 touch upon the extraction of intelligence information, and one of these conclude merely that Russian techniques in interrogation and indoctrination are derived from age-old police methods and do not depend on the use of drugs. On the validity of confessions obtained with drugs, Gottschalk found only 3 published experimental studies that he deemed worth reporting. One of these reported experiments by D.P. Morris, in which intravenous sodium amytal was helpful in detecting malingerers. Citation 12. The subject's soldiers were at first sullen, negativistic, and non-productive under amytal, but as in the interview proceeded, they revealed the fact of and causes for their malingering. Usually the interviews turned up a neurotic or psychotic basis for the deception. The other 2 confession studies, being more relevant to the highly specialized, untouched area of drugs and intelligence interrogation, deserved more detailed review. Gerson and Viktorov, citation 12, conducted amytal interviews with 17 neuropsychiatric patients, soldiers who had charges against them, at Tilton General Hospital, Fort Dix. First, they were interviewed without amytal by a psychiatrist who, neither ignoring nor stressing their situation as prisoners or suspects under scrutiny, urged each of them to discuss his social and family background, his army career, and his version of the charges pending against him. The patients were told only a few minutes in advance that narcoanalysis would be performed. The doctor was considerate but positive and forthright. He indicated that he had no choice but to submit to procedure. Their attitudes varied from unquestioning compliance to downright refusal. Each patient was brought to complete narcosis and permitted to sleep. As he became semi-conscious, he could be stimulated to speak. He was held in this stage with additional amytal while the questioning proceeded. He was questioned first about innocuous matters from his background that he had discussed before receiving the drug. Whenever possible, he was manipulated into bringing up himself the charges pending against him before being questioned about them. If he did this in a too fully conscious state, it proved more effective to ask him to, quote, talk about it later, end quote, and to interpose a topic that would diminish suspicion, delaying the interrogation on his criminal activity until he was back in the proper stage of narcosis. The procedure differed from therapeutic narcoanalysis in several ways. The setting, the type of patient, and the kind of truth sought. Also, the subjects were kept in twilight consciousness longer than usual. This state proved richest in yield of admissions prejudicial to the subject. In it, his speech was thick, mumbling and disconnected, but his discretion was remarkably reduced. This valuable interrogation period, lasting only 5 to 10 minutes at the time, could be re-induced by injecting more amytal and putting the patient back to sleep. The interrogation technique varied from case to case according to background information about the patient, the seriousness of the charges, the patient's attitude under narcosis, and his rapport with the doctor. Sometimes it was useful to pretend, as the patient grew more fully conscious, that he had already confessed during the amnestic period of the interrogation, and to urge him, while his memory and sense of self-protection were still limited, to continue to elaborate the details of what he had already described. When it was obvious that a subject was withholding the truth, his denials were quickly passed over and ignored, and the key questions would be reworded in a new approach. Several patients revealed fantasies, fears, and delusions approaching delirium, much of which could be readily distinguished from reality. But sometimes there was no way for the examiner to distinguish truth from fantasy except by reference to other sources. One subject claimed to have a child that did not exist. The end of page 32. The beginning of page 33. Another threatened to kill on sight a stepfather who had been dead a year, and yet another confessed to participating in a robbery when in fact he had only purchased goods from the participants. Testimony concerning dates and specific places was untrustworthy and often contradictory because of the patient's loss of time sense. His veracity in citing names and events proved questionable. Because of his confusion about actual events and what he thought or feared had happened, the patient at times managed to conceal the truth unintentionally. I will stop there for today. Again, if anybody wants to just read this for themselves, this is the URL right here. So Just copy it or search MKUltra into your search engine. And that's it.